The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the quiet suburban street. It was the kind of evening that felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, as if the world was holding its breath. But that calm was about to shatter. A sleek black sedan rolled to a stop at a red light, its driver tapping his fingers lightly on the steering wheel to the rhythm of a jazz tune playing softly on the radio. Inside the car sat Judge Marcus Williams, a man known for his sharp mind, unwavering integrity, and the kind of presence that commanded respect in any room. But tonight, he wasn't in his robes or seated behind a bench. He was just a man driving home after a long day, unaware that his life was about to collide with a moment that would test everything he stood for. Behind him, the flashing lights of a police cruiser erupted, slicing through the evening's tranquility. Judge Williams glanced in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowing slightly. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run the light. What could this be about? He pulled over, his heart rate picking up just a notch, not out of guilt, but out of the kind of unease that comes with being a black man in America, even one as accomplished as he was. The officer approached, his footsteps deliberate, his hand resting on his belt as if he were already preparing for trouble. The judge rolled down his window, his voice calm but firm. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" What happened next was a scene that felt ripped straight out of a nightmare, the kind of story you hear about but never imagine happening to someone like Marcus. The officer, a man with a steely gaze and a tone that dripped with suspicion, didn't ask for a license or registration. Instead, he leaned in, his voice low and accusatory. "Step out of the vehicle, sir. We've had reports of a stolen car matching this description." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Judge Williams blinked, his mind racing. A stolen car? His car? He'd owned it for years, paid for it with his own hard-earned money. But as he stepped out, hands raised slightly in a gesture of cooperation, he could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, the unspoken assumptions that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the color of his skin. The tension was palpable, the kind that makes your stomach twist and your palms sweat. The officer's questions came rapid fire, each one more pointed than the last. "Where did you get this car? Can you prove it's yours? Why are you in this neighborhood?" Judge Williams answered calmly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. He reached for his wallet, pulling out his ID and his judge's badge, hoping it would be enough to end this charade. But the officer barely glanced at them, his skepticism unwavering. "Anyone can fake those," he muttered, his tone dripping with disdain. It was a moment that laid bare the ugly underbelly of prejudice, the kind that doesn't care about titles or accomplishments, only about the assumptions it clings to. As the confrontation escalated, a small crowd began to gather, drawn by the flashing lights and the raised voices. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Among them was a young woman with her phone out, recording the scene. Her hands trembled slightly as she hit record, knowing that what she was capturing could be important, could be evidence. But for now, she stayed silent, her eyes wide as she watched the drama unfold. Judge Williams, meanwhile, was fighting to keep his composure. He knew the law better than most, knew his rights, but he also knew how quickly things could spiral out of control. He took a deep breath, his mind racing with the implications of what was happening. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been judged by the color of their skin, every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, something unexpected happened. A voice cut through the chaos, sharp and authoritative. "What's going on here?" It was another officer, this one older, his face etched, with lines that spoke of years on the force. He took in the scene with a practiced eye, his gaze lingering on Judge Williams' badge, which still lay on the hood of the car. For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. Would this new arrival see reason, or would he double down on the same assumptions that had led to this moment? The crowd held its breath, the young woman's phone still recording, as the older officer stepped forward, his expression unreadable. And just like that, the story took a turn no one could have predicted. But that's where we'll have to leave it for now. Because what happened next? Well, let's just say it's a moment you won't want to miss. The stakes are high, the tension is real, and the outcome is anything but certain. So stay tuned because this story is far from over. The older officer's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. His name was Sergeant Daniel Harris, a veteran of the force with over 2 decades of experience. He had seen it all, good cops, bad cops, and everything in between. But this felt different. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and the look on Judge Williams's face, a mix of frustration, dignity, and simmering anger, told him there was more to this story than met the eye. Harris glanced at the younger officer, whose name tag read Officer Jenkins, and then back at the judge. "Sir," Harris said, addressing Judge Williams, "can you explain what's going on here?" Judge Williams exhaled slowly, his hands still raised slightly in a gesture of calm. "Sergeant, I was driving home when I was pulled over. Officer Jenkins here seems to believe I've stolen this car. I've provided my ID and my judge's badge, but he's not convinced." His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, the kind that comes from years of navigating high-stakes situations in the courtroom. Harris's eyes flicked to the badge on the hood of the car, glinting under the streetlights. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was real, no question about it. But something about Jenkins' demeanor, the way he stood, the way he avoided Harris's gaze, set off alarm bells in Harris's mind. "Jenkins," Harris said, his tone firm but not unkind. "What made you think this car was stolen?" Jenkins shifted uncomfortably, his hand still resting on his belt. "We got a call about a stolen vehicle matching this description," he said, his voice lacking the confidence it had held just moments ago. "Black sedan, late model." The caller said, "They saw the driver acting suspiciously." Harris raised an eyebrow. "Acting suspiciously? How so?" Jenkins hesitated, his eyes darting to Judge Williams and then back to Harris. They said the driver was circling the neighborhood like he was casing houses." Judge Williams let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Casing houses?" "Sergeant, I live 3 blocks from here. I was driving home after a late meeting at the courthouse. If I was circling the neighborhood, it's because I was looking for a parking spot." His tone was calm, but the frustration was starting to show. Harris nodded slowly, his mind racing. He knew how these things could go, how a simple misunderstanding could spiral into something much worse. But he also knew that Jenkins was new, barely 6 months on the job and still green when it came to reading situations. Still, that didn't excuse what was happening here. Harris turned back to Jenkins. "Did you run the plates?" Jenkins shook his head. "Not yet. I was about to, but—" He trailed off, his face flushing. Harris sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Jenkins, you know the protocol. Always run the plates before escalating a situation like this." Jenkins nodded, but his jaw was tight, his pride clearly stung. Harris could see the conflict in his eyes, the desire to prove himself warring with the realization that he might have made a mistake. It was a tough spot to be in, but Harris knew that mistakes like this could have serious consequences, especially when they involved someone like Judge Williams. As Harris radioed in to dispatch to run the plates, the crowd that had gathered began to murmur. A man in a hoodie stepped forward, his phone in hand. "Hey, I got all this on video," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "This is messed up. You can't just pull someone over for no reason." Harris held up a hand, his expression calm but firm. "Sir, please step back, we're handling this." But the man didn't move. "Handling it? It looks like you're harassing him for no reason. He's a judge, for crying out loud." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices rising in a chorus of anger and disbelief. Judge Williams, meanwhile, stood silently, his arms crossed over his chest. He was used to being in control, to being the one who called the shots, but here, on the side of the road, he was just another black man caught in a system that too often saw him as a threat rather than a person. It was a humbling reminder of how far we still had to go, and it left a bitter taste in his mouth. He glanced at Harris, who was still waiting for confirmation from dispatch. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "I appreciate what you're trying to do here, but this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been treated like a criminal just because of the color of their skin." Harris met his gaze, his expression unreadable. He knew Judge Williams was right. He'd seen it happen too many times. Good people, innocent people, caught in the crosshairs of prejudice and fear. But he also knew that change didn't come easy, especially in a system as entrenched as law enforcement. "I hear you, Judge," he said finally, "and I'm sorry this happened. But we're going to get this sorted out, okay?" Judge Williams nodded, but the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. He knew that even if this situation was resolved, the underlying issues would remain, and that was the real problem. Just then, the radio crackled to life. "Dispatch to Sergeant Harris, come in." Harris grabbed the radio. "Go ahead, dispatch." There was a pause, and then the dispatcher's voice came through, clear and professional. "We've run the plates on that vehicle. It's registered to a Marcus Williams, no outstanding warrants or flags, clean record." Harris nodded, his jaw tightening. "Copy that, thanks." He turned to Jenkins, his expression stern. "The car's not stolen, Jenkins, it's his. You need to apologize and let him go." Jenkins' face flushed, but he didn't argue. He stepped forward, his voice low. I'm sorry, sir. I was just doing my job." Judge Williams looked at him for a long moment, his eyes searching Jenkins' face. "I understand that," he said finally. "But your job isn't just about following orders. It's about using your judgment, about seeing people as individuals, not stereotypes. I hope you'll remember that." Jenkins nodded, but his eyes were downcast, his pride clearly bruised. Harris stepped in, his tone conciliatory. "Judge, again, I'm sorry for the inconvenience. You're free to go." Judge Williams nodded, but as he turned to get back into his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As he drove away, the crowd began to disperse, their voices still buzzing with anger and disbelief. The man in the hoodie uploaded the video he'd taken to social media, captioning it with a single word: injustice. Within minutes, it began to spread, the comments section filling up with outrage and support. Meanwhile, Harris pulled Jenkins aside, his voice low but firm. "We need to talk about what happened here tonight. You've got a lot to learn, kid, and if you're going to make it in this job, you'd better learn fast." But as the night wore on, the questions lingered. Who had called in the report about a stolen car? Was it a genuine mistake or something more sinister? And what would happen next now that the video was out there for the world to see? The answers were still unclear, but one thing was certain. This story was far from over, and the consequences of what had happened on that quiet suburban street would ripple far beyond anyone's expectations. So stay tuned, because the next chapter is going to be one you won't want to miss. The video of the confrontation spread like wildfire. By morning, it had already racked up hundreds of thousands of views, with hashtags like Justice for Judge Williams and Driving While Black trending across social media platforms. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, Judge Marcus Williams found himself at the center of a national conversation about racial profiling, police accountability, and systemic bias. But for Marcus, it wasn't just a conversation, it was his life. And as he sat in his office at the courthouse, scrolling through the endless comments and think pieces, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. There was anger, of course, but also a deep sense of exhaustion. He'd spent his career fighting for justice, and now he was the one who needed it. Meanwhile, Officer Jenkins was having a very different kind of morning. The backlash was immediate and brutal. His name had been leaked online, and his social media accounts were flooded with messages ranging from disappointment to outright threats. He'd been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation, and the department was under intense pressure to address the situation. Jenkins sat in his small apartment, staring at the TV as news anchors dissected the incident, frame by frame. He felt like a ghost, like the person they were talking about wasn't even him. He'd joined the force to help people, to make a difference. How had it all gone so wrong? Sergeant Harris, too, was feeling the weight of the situation. He'd spent the night drafting reports and answering questions from higher-ups, all while trying to make sense of what had happened. He knew Jenkins had made a mistake, but he also knew that the young officer wasn't a bad person, just inexperienced and, perhaps, influenced by the biases that still lingered in the system. Harris had seen it before, the way fear and prejudice could cloud judgment, but knowing that didn't make it any easier to deal with the fallout. As he sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Are you okay? The kids are asking about you." He sighed, typing out a quick reply. "I'm fine, just a long day." But fine was the last thing he felt. As the day wore on, new details began to emerge. The anonymous call that had prompted the traffic stop was traced back to a disposable phone, one that had been purchased just hours before the incident. The caller's voice had been disguised, and the description of the stolen car had been vague enough to match Judge Williams' vehicle, but not specific enough to be conclusive. It was starting to look less like a mistake and more like a setup, but who would do such a thing? And why? These were the questions that haunted Marcus as he sat in his office, staring at the city skyline. He had enemies, of course. Anyone in his position did. But this felt personal, like someone was trying to send a message. Across town, a man sat in a dimly lit room, watching the news coverage with a satisfied smile. His name was Victor Crane, a local businessman with a grudge against Judge Williams. Years ago, Marcus had presided over a case involving Crane's company, ruling against him in a high-stakes lawsuit. The decision had cost Crane millions, and he'd never forgiven the judge for it. When he'd seen Marcus driving through the neighborhood that night, he'd seen an opportunity, a chance to humiliate the man who'd humiliated him. The call had been easy to make, and the results had been even better than he'd hoped. But, as he watched the story unfold, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd underestimated Marcus. The judge wasn't just a victim, he was a fighter, and fighters didn't back down. Back at the courthouse, Marcus was already planning his next move. He knew that the video had given him a platform, and he intended to use it. He reached out to a few trusted colleagues, including a civil rights attorney named Alicia Torres, who had a reputation for taking on tough cases. "This isn't just about me," he told her over the phone. "This is about everyone who's ever been targeted because of who they are. We need to hold them accountable, not just Jenkins, but the system that allows this to keep happening." Alicia listened quietly, her mind already racing with strategies. "I'm in," she said finally. "But this is going to get ugly. Are you ready for that?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "I've been ready my whole life." As the sun set on the city, the tension continued to build. The police department announced a press conference for the following day, promising to address the incident and outline steps they were taking to ensure accountability. But for many, the promises rang hollow. Protests were already being organized, with activists demanding not just an apology, but real, systemic change. And then there was Jenkins, who was starting to realize the full scope of what he'd done. He reached out to Harris, his voice trembling over the phone. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said. I thought I was doing the right thing." Harris sighed, his tone softening. "I know, kid, but sometimes the right thing isn't as clear as we think it is. You've got a lot to make up for, and it's not going to be easy. But the biggest question still loomed. What would happen next? Would Judge Williams' fight for justice lead to real change, or would the system close ranks to protect its own? And what about Victor Crane, who was still lurking in the shadows, watching and waiting? The answers were still unclear, but one thing was certain. This story was far from over. The stakes were higher than ever, and the next chapter was going to be one you wouldn't want to miss. So stay tuned, because the fight for justice is just getting started.